Welcome back. We are on podcast number 6, I believe, of our series Practice Makes Progress, where we're talking about spiritual practices.
Yeah.
And today we're going to be talking about interior examination.
All right. Well, I guess the question is, what does one mean when they say interior examination?
Well, it's just what it sounds like, actually. We're examining the interior of ourselves. So that we want to try and find our true selves. Maybe it's the one you hide or choose not to reveal to others, or maybe just to some people. I know some people feel like they can never truly say what they believe or what they want to, because if they did, then people might not like them or get upset.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of ways it's definitely not a practice that only started at the advent of social media, but social media is something that we always want to put our best foot forward.
Right, we're always presenting something that may not be
or just an aspect self. Even. Yeah. Like you're just like, hey, that part's successful, but we're kind of not necessarily seeing where the struggles might lie.
Yeah, and that really lines up with the next point, is that we've all known people that sort of act or seem one way in a particular context,
That's right.
and that are completely different in another one. And if I just take that into our industry, a pastor might seem one way when speaking from a stage, wise, sage, friendly or open, and be entirely different with staff or individuals. So,
right.
We've heard lots of stories on the news about that.
Yep. Unfortunately.
And unfortunately. Sometimes, I don't know, have you ever felt like you wanted just to check out of a conversation because things are getting uncomfortable and you feel like you might easily be triggered to a big emotion?
Absolutely, I have, yeah.
Yeah, and that's happened to me too. And I think in some of those cases, we're suppressing something, or something's triggering us, and that'll get into that in a few minutes.
So it's really maybe important to define what we're talking about this here. Like, 'cause there's sometimes where we're curating ourselves, if you will, and much like the idea we talked about with social media, or we just briefly talked about sometimes. We're in our profession, there's pastors that can curate themselves in the public at some point, but then sometimes in private when it comes to staff, or it's you see a lot different thing. But there's also the things of maybe not something so much curating as there's a part of you, there's hurts, there's deep things like that, and there's almost because of those emotions being triggered, maybe there's could be some suppressing going on, but we're almost maybe a little unaware of it, because I mean I can definitely say sometimes something is triggering me. I'm like, what? Why did I respond in that way?
We definitely may not be aware of some of the things, and that's another one of the reasons to look into it. And I think lots of times there's lots of stuff going on in our lives, and if we just keep pushing stuff down, and we just live on the surface where we only present, or we're only thinking about what's happening in the moment, then I think it's going to reach a breaking point at some point. And so I think when we get to the point you just made is a reason for doing examination, because we may not be aware. And I know John Calvin, who was a famous theologian and preacher, said, "The knowledge of God and that of ourselves are connected. Without knowledge of self, there is no knowledge of God. Without knowledge of God, there is no knowledge of self."
Right.
So I think if we look in the Bible, in Psalm 139, the poet David says the same things. He starts off by acknowledging that God knows him. So in Psalm 139, verses 1-3, David says this: "O Lord, you have examined my heart, and you know everything about me. You know when I sit down or stand up. You know my thoughts even when I'm far away. You see me when I travel and when I rest at home, and you know everything I do." And he goes on for several verses this way, saying no matter where he goes or what he does, God knows and is with him. And Rich Villodas, in his book, The Deeply Formed Life, which we're getting quite a few of our ideas from today.
Absolutely.
He says the psalmist is overwhelmed not with grief, but with gratitude and satisfaction, because God knows him and claims him. These words are not words of stalking or God using surveillance to catch us when we do something wrong. David knows something about God. He knows that he is fully present to us. And it's actually quite a beautiful image.
And I think that's a really good point, because I think sometimes we can hear that, the idea that God might know that, and it's more fear-based in response.
Yeah.
And here he's saying, even with the beauty of knowing him, even the rough parts,
Yep.
God is responding in a kind of love, in love.
Yeah. And then we get to the part you were mentioning. By the end of the poem, David says something that indicates, although God knows everything about him inside and out, David doesn't even know everything about himself. He says in verse 23 and 24, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you, and lead me along the path of everlasting life." God is actually David is asking God to show him himself. And it's a prayer of internal examination with the point of being closer to God.
And I think it's a great thing to note, because we have blind spots.
Yeah.
And I think what happens is we sometimes, unfortunately, they can be very blind to us, but not necessarily blind to other people. Mm-hmm. And it's really, the idea there is we're taking time, and this is very much connected to prayer and meditation and all that, which we talked a little bit about on Sunday. But it is taking time to God to, like, hey, reveal the thing I can't see.
Yeah.
That is possibly affecting myself and definitely affecting those around
Other
me.
people, yeah. So if we look for other examples of examination in the Bible, in 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul wrote that we should examine ourselves before communion. In 1 Corinthians 11:28, he says, "Everyone ought to examine themselves before they eat of the bread and drink the cup." Then there's an examination of faith, also in 2 Corinthians, where Paul says, "Examine yourselves to see if your faith is genuine. Test yourselves. Surely you know that Jesus Christ is among you. If not, you failed the test of genuine faith." And there's another one I'll bring to mind today, which is Galatians 3 and 4, which is an examination of our work. "If anyone thinks he is important when he is nothing, he is fooling himself. Everyone should look at himself and see how he does his own work. Then he can be happy in what he has done, and he should not compare himself with his neighbor."
And so I think it's probably good, as we get into this, to really talk about the ultimate goal.
Yep.
In what we're doing this, and Rich Philotis does sum it up beautifully. And I think it just, if there's a take home point, if anyone is like, if you want to write down something, this is the thing to write down. And this is what he says: the goal of self-examination is freedom.
Freedom.
It is not the list of how bad you are, or even how good you are. It's the idea of freedom, destructive thought patterns, inner messages, how we've wrongly perceived things. Whatever it is, the goal is ultimately
Free from those things.
Yeah.
So we're going to look at a roadmap in just a minute of sort of a guideline to help you get started in interior examination. It's a big topic, and this is just scratching the surface today. But before we get there, I just wanted to look at a couple of barriers to internal or interior examination. And one is busyness.
Yeah.
Our culture thrives on busyness. If someone says how busy they are, I think my first impulse is to tell how much busier I am than they are.
Yeah, it's a competition a lot of times.
A lot of times. The other thing is that interior examination requires time and usually solitude in order to reflect on what's going on inside. And I know for me, it's much easier to either to keep working or distract myself or doom scroll or any other busy thing that helps me avoid interior examination. Because sometimes I'm a little bit afraid of what I might find in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing that Rich talks about in the book is compartmentalization.
That's a big one.
And another, I think, particularly for followers of Jesus, it's easier for us to do this. We offer God surrender in some areas of our life, but not, we actually deny God access to others. And I mean, God's interested in integrating all of our life together. And I think we cut ourselves off from the contradictory or unpleasant parts and stop God from doing that. And again, Rich has a beautiful summary where he says Christian spirituality involves acknowledging all our part selves, exposing them to God's love, and letting Him weave them into the new person He is making.
All right. So in all that, maybe the question to ask is where do we start? What are the things that we want to do when it comes to self-examination?
Yeah, well, a big part of who we are is where we come from.
Right.
So I think we start with our family of origin because they're the primary influences on us in our sort of first part of our lives. And they definitely have a lasting impact into adulthood.
And we've talked about it before too, in our series, building community, and our ability to return to joy from the negative emotions, the big emotions, I should say, we have, and return to joy, or process those healthily, can quite often start, and the practice we learned, good and bad, can come from our family of origin. So just seeing that, to see like, oh, maybe one or two ways we return from a big emotion like shame or disgust, we could have had that modeled poorly for us, even though some other ones might have been modeled very positively for us.
Yeah, and that we're going to discuss 3 categories that can negatively inform our development, and we may, like you said, may not even be aware of them. There are patterns, trauma, and scripts. So what we might mean by patterns are there repeated behaviors or practices, habits or ways of thinking that get passed from generation to generation.
Kind of like we were just talking.
So it's a legacy. Yeah, exactly like that. And you're right, they can be positive, like a love of art or how you manage your money or how you and where you take vacations. But they can also be negative. Workaholism, not being committed in relationships or avoiding conflict. All of those can be carried on from generation to generation. And we know families like that where they never seem to fight, but they don't deal with their stuff either.
Right, absolutely.
So I think once we identify patterns and legacy, we see how we might be predisposed to make them, and then we can make different choices, which was what you were alluding to when we talked in our previous series. And again, I'm going to review these quickly because time's flying by here. The next one is trauma. And again, I think when we say the word trauma, we think of big life-changing moments. I know in my life, my parents separated when I was about 10 years old.
Right.
That's a big life-changing moment. But it can also be smaller things and even lack of things that have an outcome of emotional distress. And again, they can be certainly be things we're not aware of. So there's the 2 sides that I just mentioned here. Think of it like a coin. One side is being on the receiving end of what I didn't deserve, abuse or abandonment in my case. And the other side of the coin is not getting what I do deserve. And psychiatrist Donald Winnicott refers to it as nothing happening when something might profitably have happened.
Right.
So something good that should have been given to you that wasn't. And that could be our parents or caregivers that might have been present, but we never received nurturing or warmth or attachment or had an environment where we felt safe or seen. Now, again, there's many degrees of this, from super traumatic to hardly any trauma. But I think no matter how great our families were or weren't, there's always going to be gaps.
Yeah.
Nobody's perfect.
Yeah. And I think sometimes, you know, so where we see the gaps and we don't see them is because we've become so used to it.
Yeah.
For it not to be there, the thing that maybe that should have been there that wasn't. So it's harder to see because it's just something that should have been there but wasn't.
Yeah.
We go on life without it being there, and we really don't know. And
But
sometimes those are harder to see.
And it does make us behave a certain way.
Yeah.
And so the goal then of understanding your trauma is not to just remember what happened and have someone to blame, but to sort of name and reject scripts that we believe because of the trauma have happened, and we want that freedom and being able to flourish from life-giving messages, which is a nice lead into the next step, which is scripts.
Right.
So we're going to define scripts as messages we receive, the roles we are given, and the ways we believe we must live that have been consciously handed to us or even subconsciously interpreted by us. Just an easy example here, maybe, I think I saw this on TV actually, where a kid got straight A's in school and the dad was never happy.
Right.
He was like, you just got an A, it should have been an A plus. And I think a message we can get subconsciously from that is that we're just never good enough.
Yeah, it's universal statements essentially we build over that, and I'm never good enough, and so even that thing carries us. Whatever you do in life, whether it's at your job or something, whatever that might be, and even though you might do an excellent job, you'll never feel satisfied.
Yeah,
and there becomes a universal. No matter what I do, it's never going to be good enough.
So again, the work of examining your family of origin gives us insight into ourselves and how we're formed. But in order to be healed and from any dysfunction, we have to believe and orient our lives around the good news of the gospel. And again, Rich quotes Colossians 1:16. Christ made everything in the heavens and on the earth. Everything was made by him and for him. Christ was before all things, and all things are held together by him. Now we're going to talk about how we apply the gospel. We're going to talk about some other examinations we might do first. But again, just to sum up, family of origin, whenever the scripts of my family of origin surface, my soul needs to return to this truth, which is Colossians 1:16. But unless I'm doing the work of examination, I will not locate the source of the wounds the wounded ways that I've been formed.
Okay.
Let's go on and talk about examination of our feelings and emotions.
Sure.
Now, sometimes there can be a distinction between feelings and emotions.
Right.
And Alice Miller, who's a psychologist, writes that the word feeling designates a conscious perception of an emotion which can be triggered by the subconscious.
Right.
So it's what you actually feel in your body. So I feel sad, and the way I feel sad, I might have a sinking feeling in my stomach, or I might be brought to tears, or just feel a heavy weight. So that's what she calls the feelings part of it.
Mm-hmm.
But the emotion, the subconscious part, is sadness.
Okay.
So in some contexts, and it could be a cultural context, a church context, or even a family context, for example, it might be frowned upon to be sad as it shows a sign of weakness.
Right.
Or other times you shouldn't show grief because it shows a lack of faith. So consequently, we learn to avoid, repress, or rationalize away our feelings. And then the thing you talked about at the outset was the examination of our reactions. So we, in our other series, talked about the 6 big emotions, and we need to examine our reactions to people, circumstances, news, or experience when the reaction is disproportionate to the actual event. So when we are examining our feelings and reactions, it can often lead us back to the family of origin, the trauma scripts or patterns that have developed us. So again, these are connected, but this is sort of the outcome of not dealing with it. It tends to break down, and we then have these really disproportionate reactions.
Yeah, and I think what happens is we could be surprised ourselves.
Yep.
I know I can think of many times when I've had a kind of reaction to something.
Yep.
And someone, Courtney, my wife, said like, "Hey, what's going on there?"
Yeah.
And I'm just like that realization, like, wow, yeah, I don't know.
I don't know. Yeah.
Why I responded that way.
Yeah.
At that point, there's something underlying here, and so yeah, it's surprising, and it's even the big response. Like there have been times when she sort of has mentioned that to me, and it's like I almost didn't realize that my reaction was as big as it
exactly.
was, and it's really can catch us by surprise.
Yeah, that's happened to me too. So we want to do interior examination, but we don't want to stop just at discovery.
Right.
There's no point in just opening wounds just to relive them again. We want to be able to turn that around and be healed and learn to flourish. So something you might find helpful is a tool that Rich Villodas suggests in his book, The Deeply Formed Life, which is also similar. Well, it's almost exactly like a tool that we studied years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago in the book Gospel Fluency by Jeff Vanderstelt.
Right.
And it's actually a series of questions that lead us from discovery to the healing message of Jesus. So we're just going to go over those questions right now and just see how that works. So the first thing is, once you've become aware that you've reacted to something disproportionately, you're going to go over the event and see what it is that maybe triggered you to overreact.
Right.
So what happened? Write it down. And then really try and identify what you're feeling, trying to identify the emotion. Because you might just feel a heaviness or the tears, but you might not immediately connect that to emotion of sadness or anger or anxiety. Then it's important to do the interior examination part, which is what do I really believe about myself, or what story am I telling myself and why? What are the scripts? What are the patterns? What are the traumas that make me feel this way? And what am I believing that makes me react to this way? And then it's important to go, what does the gospel say? And there's several different facets here. So we need to look at the character of God or Jesus. What is God like?
Right.
What is God doing, or what's he already done that we can read about in the Bible or maybe in your own life? And then contrast that with our dysfunction with what God wants for us. And here the idea is to replace lies with truth or negative messages with positive ones. And then, so that step can be quite a lot of work, because there's, things to look up in the Bible. And there's, and again, I'll say this at the end, but I'll maybe throw it in here as well. You may need to go and see a professional counselor to develop some of these ideas. It may be way too traumatic for this to do on your own. But I found that by doing this, and I've made this practice, this process, a part of my life on many different occasions since we talked about it. And I do find it very helpful in just sort of day-to-day stuff.
Right.
And then I think it's always important to come to an action. So what countercultural action is needed is the way Rich phrases it. Or Jeff says, how can we live in light of who we are in light of what God has done or who he is?
Right.
So I think it's important to actually get to the point of doing something, and it could be an apology. It might just even be telling someone about the experience, how you processed it. And we talked a lot about that in the last series, where sometimes just talking it through and how you might do it differently next time.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a huge topic. And, I think going back to what you said, as far as this is not a practice that that we do instead of possibly going to see a mental health professional. Something you might want to do as well as, or even with, depending upon what you need to go through. And even this whole practice, this is not the be all and end all of what this is. This is really what we can do in roughly 20 minutes and kind of share in this. But hopefully what this does is sort of start to it kind of was thinking about the spiritual practice, and just some of the resources that we've mentioned that can really help get started in that.
Yeah, we'll post those in the notes, and then again, my goal our goal in doing this today is just to help you, give you a place to start.
Yeah, and then remember that this is all about connecting to God. And ultimately, as we connect to God and we allow God to sort of help us in this examination, we are better able to connect to ourselves, and we become just hopefully growing and more whole. And that might take some growth and maturity, and definitely some healing.
Sure.
So we hope that you can add this regularly into your life. Take some time. This is none of these when we talk about this as a practice is just like you'll run out and do it all perfectly. Yeah. It really is the idea of just sort of adding these in a rhythm in life, and sometimes you'll be surprised when those things, that examination happens, like, oh, here's this thing, and some days there might nothing come up in that moment, and that's okay. Maybe there's just nothing that day that is needing to be pressing. And that's fine. And another day it might reveal itself. That's why we just have that practice continually. So don't be afraid to go in this. And again, the things that have happened that the self-examination might reveal might lead you to need to see a mental health professional. Please do so. They can be immensely helpful in your journey of healing. Thank you for joining us. Please like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.